Try saying that again, but this time, say it like you belong here. The words didn't just land, they sliced clean through the soft jazz drifting across the room, cutting past the clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of billion-dollar conversations like a blade wrapped in silk. For a second, nobody moved. Not the server carrying a tray of champagne flutes, not the couple mid-laugh near the window overlooking the San Francisco skyline, not even the pianist whose fingers hovered just a breath too long above the keys. At the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks, a young black waitress in a pressed white shirt and black apron, her hand still resting lightly on the neck of a wine bottle that cost more than her weekly paycheck. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She didn't even blink. Across from her, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, the kind of relaxed arrogance that money builds over time settling into his posture like it belonged there. At 39, Ethan was the definition of controlled power, tailored navy suit, silver watch catching the amber light, a man who had closed deals worth hundreds of millions without ever raising his voice. And yet tonight, his voice carried. Not loud, but deliberate. Designed to be heard. Designed to be felt. Go ahead, he added, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, order it again, slowly. A few guests at the table chuckled, the kind of polite laughter that comes with expensive dinners and unspoken hierarchies. Naomi had heard that laugh before. Not here, not exactly, but in 100 different forms, in 100 different rooms where people like her were expected to be efficient, invisible, and quiet. She adjusted the bottle slightly, her grip steady, her movements precise, as if the air itself had thickened around her. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't need a name on the door, floor-to-ceiling glass, a panoramic view stretching miles out over the bay, every table spaced just far enough apart to feel private but close enough for status to echo. It was where power came to dine with itself. And tonight, Naomi was just another part of the background. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Ethan glanced at the menu again, then back at her, eyes sharp, measuring. Mandarin pronunciation isn't easy, he said casually, swirling the last inch of bourbon in his glass, especially if you're not used to certain sounds. Another ripple of laughter. Softer this time. Safer. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the order without acknowledging the insult. Her silence wasn't submission. It was timing. Because what no one at that table noticed, not Ethan, not the investors seated beside him, not the guests pretending not to listen, was the way her eyes shifted, just slightly, just enough to change the entire gravity of the moment. She had been quiet all night. Observing. Listening. Translating more than just words. And now, for the first time, she set the bottle down. Slowly. Deliberately. As if placing something heavier than glass onto the table. The music in the background resumed, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another room. Ethan leaned forward, expecting compliance, expecting the same careful repetition he'd heard minutes earlier. Expecting to win a game no one had agreed to play. Naomi lifted her gaze to meet his. Not challenging. Not defensive. Just, steady. And in that single second, something shifted. Not loud enough to name. Not obvious enough to stop the room. But real. Because power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it waits to be heard. Naomi did not rush her answer because she understood something Ethan Caldwell did not, that silence, when held long enough, can weigh more than words ever could, and in that moment the entire table began to feel it, a subtle pressure building beneath the polished surface of confidence and curated charm, as if the room itself was waiting to see who would break first, and Ethan, still leaning forward with that faint, practiced smile, mistook it for hesitation, for uncertainty, for exactly what he expected from someone in her position, so he exhaled softly through his nose and added, almost kindly, almost generous, take your time, we are in no hurry, but the tone carried something else beneath it, something quieter, sharper, the assumption that time belonged to him, that control was his by default, and a man seated to his right, a venture partner with a silk tie and careful eyes, shifted slightly in his chair, glancing between them as if sensing the imbalance beginning to tilt, while further down the table a woman with a subtle Shanghai accent paused mid-sip, her glass hovering just below her lips, her attention no longer on the skyline but on Naomi, on the stillness that did not match the uniform. And Naomi noticed all of it, not directly, not with obvious reaction, but in the way her posture aligned, in the way her shoulders settled instead of tensed, in the way her breathing slowed instead of quickened, because she had been in rooms like this before, not as a guest, never as a guest, but as a presence that learned quickly how power sounded when it was unchallenged, and more importantly, how fragile it became the moment it was questioned. Ethan tapped the edge of his glass lightly with his finger, a small, rhythmic sound that cut through the quiet like a metronome counting down to a conclusion he had already written in his mind, and then, with a slight tilt of his head, he repeated the dish name again, exaggerating the tones just enough to turn language into performance, into something that invited amusement rather than respect, and this time a few more people laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, but enough to fill the gap, enough to keep the moment from collapsing into discomfort, except it did not work, because the silence that followed was different now, heavier, anchored, and Naomi finally moved, not quickly, not defensively, but with intention, her hands sliding away from the bottle, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as she lifted her gaze fully to meet his, not looking up at him, not looking past him, but directly at him, as if for the first time he was not the center of the room but simply another person inside it. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen, did not carry the strain he had been waiting for. Instead it arrived smooth, measured, unmistakably clear, and not in the careful, broken rhythm he had mocked, but in fluent Mandarin, precise in tone, natural in cadence, the kind of pronunciation that does not come from memorization but from understanding, and for a fraction of a second no one reacted, because the brain always needs a moment to catch up when expectation is broken, and then the woman with the Shanghai accent lowered her glass completely, her eyes widening just slightly, not in shock, but in recognition, real recognition, and she turned her head toward Ethan, not Naomi, as if the shift in power had already been decided, and Ethan's smile did not disappear. Not immediately, but it paused, just enough to reveal something underneath it, something unfamiliar, because for the first time that night, he was no longer the one controlling the language of the room. The sentence did not end where they expected it to because Naomi did not stop after a simple reply. She continued, her Mandarin flowing with a calm precision that carried meaning beyond the menu itself, correcting a subtle mispronunciation Ethan had made earlier, refining the tone, adjusting the phrasing, the kind of correction that only someone deeply familiar with the language would even notice, let alone deliver with such quiet confidence, and as her words settled into the air the effect was immediate but not loud. It was the kind of shift that happened inside people first, in the tightening of posture, in the slight turning of heads, in the way attention redirected without permission, and the woman from Shanghai finally spoke, her voice soft but unmistakably certain, confirming the accuracy of Naomi's pronunciation with a nod that carried more weight than applause ever could, and just like that the room recalibrated, not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with something far more powerful, recognition, real and undeniable, and Ethan felt it before he could name it. The subtle erosion of the position he had assumed was unshakable, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass, not enough to show strain, but enough to betray that something had shifted beneath the surface, because this was not part of the script he had written in his head, not part of the controlled exchange where he led and others followed. And for a brief moment he searched her face, not with the dismissive glance he had given before, but with something closer to curiosity, even calculation, as if trying to place her within a framework that suddenly no longer fit, and Naomi did not rush to fill the silence that followed. She let it expand, let it breathe, because she understood that the moment did not belong to her words anymore, it belonged to what those words had revealed. And around them the room began to move again, but differently now, conversations resuming in lower tones, glances exchanged with a new awareness, the invisible lines of status redrawn without anyone announcing it, and the venture partner who had shifted earlier leaned back slightly, his expression no longer amused but thoughtful, as if re-evaluating more than just the interaction, as if reconsidering the assumptions that had been sitting quietly at the table all night. And Ethan, still composed, still outwardly controlled, placed his glass down with deliberate care, the soft contact against the table sounding louder than it should have, a small reminder that even controlled movements can carry weight when the balance of a room changes. And then he spoke again, but this time the tone was different, not apologetic, not yet, but measured in a way it had not been before. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, the question simple on the surface but carrying something deeper beneath it, because it was no longer about the menu, no longer about pronunciation, it was about understanding how the person he had reduced to a role he barely acknowledged had just stepped outside of it so completely. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, without triumph, without any need to prove more than she already had, and for a second the contrast was undeniable, the man who owned the room and the woman who had just changed it, not with volume, not with force, but with something far more difficult to dismiss, clarity. And in that clarity was a quiet truth that no one at the table could fully ignore anymore, that what they had overlooked was never small, it was simply unseen, until now. Naomi did not answer immediately, and that pause was different from the ones before, not heavy with tension but grounded in control, as if she was deciding how much of herself this room deserved to understand. And Ethan, still watching her closely, felt that distinction without fully grasping it, because for the first time that evening he was no longer dictating the pace of the exchange, he was waiting for it, and that alone shifted something fundamental, the quiet authority he carried now meeting something equally steady but entirely unfamiliar. And when Naomi finally spoke, her voice remained calm, even, untouched by the attention surrounding her. "I learned because I needed to," she said, not defensive, not proud, just factual, as if the explanation required no decoration. And a few people at the table exchanged glances, subtle but meaningful, because the answer did not satisfy curiosity in the way they expected. It did not offer a neat story or an impressive credential, it left space, and that space made them lean in, not physically, but mentally. And the woman from Shanghai set her glass down completely now, her interest no longer hidden. "Your tones are not just correct," she added, her voice carrying a quiet authority of its own, "they are natural." And that word lingered, natural, because it implied time, effort, immersion, something far beyond casual learning. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing that confirmation, his expression still composed but no longer dismissive, because he understood value when he heard it, even if it came from a place he had overlooked. And yet something in him resisted fully conceding the moment, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, the kind built over years of being the one people deferred to. And so he leaned back slightly, reclaiming a fragment of the posture he had started with, and asked, "Needed to for what?" the question sharper now, more focused, not mocking, but probing, as if he could re-establish control by defining the context. And Naomi met that question the same way she had met everything else, without flinching, without rushing. "For my mother," she said, and the simplicity of it landed differently than anything else she had said so far, because it did not challenge him, it did not correct him, it did something far more disarming. It humanized her in a way the room had not allowed before, and the conversation around them softened again, not out of discomfort this time, but out of attention, real attention. And Naomi continued, not because she needed to prove anything, but because the moment had already shifted beyond performance. "She worked 2 jobs when I was growing up," she said, her voice steady, her eyes not leaving his. "One of them at a small import shop in Oakland. Most of the customers spoke Mandarin, and nobody had time to translate." She paused briefly, not for effect, but because the memory carried weight of its own. "So I learned," and there was no embellishment in that sentence, no attempt to make it sound extraordinary, which somehow made it exactly that. And Ethan's gaze held hers a fraction longer than before, the calculation in his eyes giving way to something else, something quieter, recognition not of status, but of effort, of a kind of discipline he understood deeply even if it came from a different world. And around them the room continued to recalibrate in small, almost invisible ways, the venture partner now watching Naomi with a thoughtful expression that suggested he was seeing more than just a server, the woman from Shanghai nodding slightly as if acknowledging not just the language but the story behind it. And Ethan finally exhaled, a subtle release of something he had not realized he was holding, his hand resting against the table now instead of gripping the glass. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed in a way no one could mistake. "That is impressive," he said, not loudly, not performatively, but clearly enough that the words carried across the table. And Naomi inclined her head once, acknowledging it without absorbing it, because she did not need his validation to confirm what she already knew. and in that moment the balance of the room settled into something new, not equal, not entirely, but closer than it had been before, because power had shifted, not through confrontation, not through force, but through something far more enduring, the quiet, undeniable presence of someone who refused to be defined by the role others assigned to her. The compliment did not echo the way Ethan expected it to, because Naomi did not absorb it as validation. She treated it the same way she had treated his earlier words, as something that existed outside of her center, acknowledged but not defining, and that subtle difference lingered in the air longer than the words themselves, creating a quiet imbalance that the room could feel but not quite articulate, and Ethan noticed it. Not immediately, but in the way her posture remained unchanged, in the way her eyes did not soften or shift, in the way she did not lean into the approval he had offered as so many others often did, and for a moment he found himself searching for the familiar pattern, the expected response, the small signs of deference that usually followed his recognition, but they did not come, and that absence said more than any reaction could have, because it suggested something he rarely encountered, someone who was not measuring themselves against him at all, and that realization, subtle as it was, forced him to adjust again, not outwardly, not in a way anyone could easily point to, but internally, recalibrating the assumptions he had brought into the room without ever questioning them, and across the table the venture partner leaned forward slightly now, his interest no longer passive. "Where did you study?" he asked, his tone curious but respectful, as if the earlier dynamic had already been replaced with something more balanced, and Naomi turned her attention to him briefly, answering with the same clarity, "Mostly at home," she said, and a faint shift moved through the group, not disbelief, but intrigue, because the answer did not align with the polished narrative they were used to, no prestigious institution, no formal credentials, just discipline and necessity, and a woman from Shanghai smiled faintly, a knowing expression that suggested she understood the kind of learning that does not come with certificates, and Ethan, listening, felt that contrast more sharply now, the difference between curated success and lived effort becoming harder to ignore, and he set his hands flat on the table, grounding himself in a posture that was no longer about control but about presence, and for the first time that night he looked at Naomi not as part of the environment, not as background, but as an individual with a trajectory he had not considered, and the weight of that shift settled quietly, without announcement, reshaping the tone of the entire table, because once perception changes, it does not easily return to what it was, and Naomi, sensing that shift without reacting to it, reached for the wine bottle again, her movements smooth, professional, the same as before, but now they carried a different kind of attention, every gesture observed with a new awareness that had not existed minutes earlier, and as she poured, the soft sound of liquid meeting glass filled the space between them, grounding the moment in something simple, something real, and Ethan watched that motion, the precision of it, the steadiness, and realized that what he had mistaken for limitation earlier was in fact restraint, a choice, not a lack, and that recognition, quiet as it was, carried weight, because it challenged something deeper than the moment itself. It challenged the lens through which he had been viewing the entire room, and when Naomi finished pouring and set the bottle down, she did not linger, she did not wait for further acknowledgement, she simply prepared to step away, returning to the rhythm of her work as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and that, more than anything, unsettled the balance Ethan had relied on, because it meant the moment had not been about proving something to him, it had been about revealing something he had failed to see, and as she turned slightly, ready to move to the next table, Ethan spoke again, not to stop her, but because something in him was no longer willing to let the moment pass without understanding it more fully. "Naomi," he said, using her name now, the first time he had done so, and the sound of it carried a different weight than before, less assumption, more intention, and she paused, just enough to acknowledge it, turning her head slightly back toward him, and in that small, quiet exchange, the room held its breath again, not in tension, but in recognition that something had shifted. Far beyond a simple conversation, something that could not be undone by returning to business as usual, because once someone steps out of the role you assign them, you can never quite place them back inside it again. Naomi paused just long enough to acknowledge her name, not startled, not flattered, just aware, and that awareness carried a quiet weight because it confirmed something the room had already begun to realize, that this was no longer a one-sided exchange, and Ethan, watching her turn slightly back toward him, felt the difference in a way that was difficult to ignore. The distance between who he thought she was and who she had revealed herself to be now impossible to reconcile with a single assumption, and for a brief moment he did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that whatever came next would define the tone of everything that followed, not just for her, but for everyone watching, and there were many watching now, not openly, not with obvious curiosity, but in the subtle stillness that had settled across the table, in the way conversations at nearby tables seemed to quiet just slightly, as if the room itself had leaned in, and Ethan finally shifted in his seat, not leaning back this time, not asserting space, but grounding himself in the moment as it was. "Do you enjoy languages?" he asked, the question simple, almost neutral, but carrying an undercurrent that was new, something closer to genuine interest than performance, and Naomi considered it for a fraction of a second, not because it was difficult, but because she understood that the question was not really about languages, it was about understanding her beyond the role he had assigned to her earlier, and when she answered, her voice remained steady. "I enjoy understanding people," she said, and the response landed differently than expected, softer, but deeper, because it reframed everything, language not as a skill to display, but as a bridge to something more meaningful, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing that. Because it was not the kind of answer that fit neatly into the categories he was used to, it did not present itself as a measurable asset or a line on a resume. It suggested perspective, something less tangible but no less valuable, and across the table the venture partner let out a quiet breath, almost a sound of recognition, as if something about that answer resonated beyond the immediate conversation, and the woman from Shanghai smiled again, this time more openly, her expression warm with a kind of approval that did not need to be spoken, and Naomi, sensing the shift but not leaning into it, adjusted her stance slightly, preparing once more to continue her work, because for her the evening had not paused, it had simply revealed something others had not noticed before, and Ethan, watching her, realized that this was the part he did not understand, not the language, not the discipline, but the ability to step in and out of a moment like this without needing it to define you, and that realization lingered, quiet but persistent, challenging something deeper than the interaction itself, because it forced him to confront the difference between influence that is given and value that exists regardless of recognition, and for a man who had built his world on control, on perception, on being seen a certain way, that distinction mattered more than he expected, and he found himself asking another question before she could fully turn away, not out of habit, but out of a growing need to understand the gap he had just discovered. "How many languages do you speak?" he said, and this time there was no trace of mockery, no edge, just curiosity, and Naomi met that question with the same calm clarity. "Enough," she replied, and there was a faint hint of something in that answer, not humor exactly, but confidence, quiet and unforced, the kind that does not need to be explained to be understood, and a few people at the table smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it carried a truth they could feel, and Ethan exhaled softly. A small release that marked the final shift in his posture, the last piece of the earlier dynamic falling away, because he understood now that whatever he had assumed at the beginning of the evening no longer applied, and as Naomi turned once more to continue her path through the restaurant, the room did not return to what it had been before. It could not, because something had been seen that could not be unseen, and Ethan remained seated, his gaze following her for just a moment longer before returning to the table, not with the same authority he had carried earlier, but with something quieter, more grounded, the beginning of a perspective he had not expected to gain from a conversation he almost dismissed. And in that quiet shift, the true weight of the moment settled. Not in what had been said, but in what had been understood. The conversation at the table tried to move forward, but it no longer flowed the same way, because once attention has been redirected, it does not easily return to its original path, and even as plates were adjusted and glasses refilled, there was a subtle shift in how people spoke, a slight hesitation before jokes, a more deliberate choice of words, as if everyone had become quietly aware that the room was no longer operating under the same assumptions, and Ethan felt it more than anyone, not because he was uncomfortable, but because he was observant, and observation had always been one of the skills that made him successful, the ability to read a room, to sense opportunity, to adjust before others even realized a change had occurred, and now that same instinct was turning inward, examining something he had not needed to question before, and he picked up his glass again, not to drink, but to occupy the moment, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window where the city lights stretched out in sharp lines and reflections, reminder of the world he controlled so well, predictable, structured, responsive to influence, and then his gaze returned to the table, where something less predictable had just unfolded, something that did not follow the usual rules of status and visibility, and across from him the venture partner cleared his throat lightly, steering the conversation back toward business, discussing projections, timelines, numbers that usually anchored Ethan's focus without effort, but tonight the numbers felt slightly distant, not irrelevant, just less immediate, because a different kind of calculation had taken hold, one that could not be expressed in percentages or quarterly returns, and as the discussion continued, Ethan found himself listening, but not fully engaging, his attention divided between the familiar rhythm of negotiation and the quiet awareness that something in the room had shifted in a way that could not be quantified, and then, without drawing attention, he made a small decision, one that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but to him it marked a clear departure from the earlier version of himself that had walked into the restaurant, and he set his glass down, leaned slightly toward the edge of the table, and signaled subtly to the manager standing near the entrance, a gesture so controlled it barely registered as movement, and the manager, trained to read such signals instantly, nodded and approached with quiet efficiency, leaning in just enough to hear without interrupting the flow of the room. And Ethan spoke in a low voice, measured, precise, asking a question that would not have crossed his mind an hour earlier. The server, Naomi Brooks, how long has she been here? And the manager blinked once, surprised not by the question itself, but by the fact that it had been asked at all, because people like Ethan Caldwell did not usually inquire about staff beyond immediate service, and yet he answered quickly, professionally, a little over a year, sir, and Ethan nodded, absorbing that information as if it carried more weight than it should have. Because in that moment it did, it reframed the timeline, the idea that someone with that level of discipline, that level of awareness, had been moving through this environment unnoticed for that long, and the manager hesitated briefly, then added, she is one of our most consistent employees, and there was something in that word, consistent, that settled differently now, not as a basic expectation, but as a quiet indicator of something deeper, reliability built without recognition, effort sustained without spotlight, and Ethan leaned back slightly, dismissing the manager with a subtle nod, but his mind did not return to the conversation in front of him, instead it lingered on that realization, because it connected to something larger, something he understood from a different context, the idea that the most valuable elements in any system are often the ones that operate without drawing attention, and as the table continued its discussion, he found himself watching the room again, but this time with a different lens, noticing details he had ignored before, the precision of movement, the timing of service, the quiet coordination that kept everything running smoothly, and at the center of that awareness was Naomi, moving from table to table with the same calm efficiency, no performance, no display, just execution, and the more he observed, the clearer it became that what had happened earlier was not an exception, it was a glimpse, a brief moment where something normally hidden had been revealed, and that realization carried a quiet weight, because it challenged not just his perception of her, but his perception of value itself, and for the first time that evening, Ethan was not thinking about control, or influence, or outcomes, he was thinking about understanding, and that shift, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of something he had not anticipated when he first sat down at that table. The night continued, but it no longer felt like just another high-end dinner where numbers moved and egos quietly competed beneath polished conversations, because something intangible had settled into the space, something that shifted the way people looked at one another, and Ethan could feel it even as the discussion returned to projections and expansion strategies, his voice steady as he responded, his tone precise as he outlined timelines, but beneath that surface there was a second layer. Now, a quieter awareness that followed his attention every time Naomi passed through the room, not in distraction, but in recognition, and recognition, once formed, does not fade easily, and as dessert menus were placed on the table, the soft rustle of paper blending with the low murmur of conversation, the woman from Shanghai leaned slightly toward Ethan, her voice measured, thoughtful, you know, she said, fluency like that does not come from necessity alone, it comes from discipline, and Ethan nodded once, because he understood discipline better than most, he had built his entire career on it, long hours, calculated risks, relentless focus, but hearing it applied to someone he had dismissed less than an hour ago carried a different weight, and he found himself replying with more honesty than he intended. "I underestimated her," he said, not loudly, not as a declaration, but as a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be defended, and the woman gave a small, approving nod, not because of the admission itself, but because of what it represented, the ability to recognize a mistake without trying to reframe it. And across the table the venture partner raised an eyebrow slightly, not in surprise, but in interest, as if noting the shift in Ethan's tone as carefully as he would note a shift in market conditions, because men like them paid attention to changes, especially the ones that were not immediately obvious. And as the conversation drifted again, lighter now, less rigid, Ethan's attention returned once more to the room, but this time his observation was different, not scanning for advantage, not measuring influence, but noticing patterns he had previously ignored, the way Naomi anticipated needs before they were spoken, the way she adjusted her pace depending on the rhythm of each table, the way her presence seemed to stabilize the environment without drawing attention to itself, and it reminded him of something he had seen before, not in restaurants, but in boardrooms, the rare individuals who held systems together not through authority, but through awareness, people who understood how to move within complexity without disrupting it, and that comparison lingered, reshaping his perspective in a way that extended beyond the evening itself, because it suggested something broader, something he had not fully considered. That value does not always present itself in the forms people are trained to recognize, and as Naomi approached their table once more, carrying a small tray with a quiet efficiency, the movement felt different now, not because she had changed, but because the way she was being seen had changed, and Ethan noticed the shift in how others interacted with her as well, the subtle increase in eye contact, the slight adjustment in tone, the unspoken respect that had replaced earlier indifference, and when she reached the table, placing the desserts with the same calm precision as before, Ethan spoke again, not to test, not to challenge, but simply to engage. "Naomi," he said, his voice steady, "thank you," and the words were simple, almost ordinary, but they carried something that had not been present earlier, sincerity without performance, and Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it with the same composed presence she had maintained all night, because to her the work had not changed, only the perception around it had, and as she stepped away once more, the moment did not demand attention, it did not need to, because its impact had already settled, not in the volume of what was said, but in the quiet recalibration of how value was understood, and Ethan, watching her return to the rhythm of the room, realized something that did not fit into any report or projection he had ever studied, that influence, real influence, is not always about being the loudest voice or the most visible presence. Sometimes it is about the quiet ability to shift a room without asking for permission, and that realization, subtle as it was, stayed with him long after the conversation moved on, anchoring itself in a place deeper than strategy or control, because it was not just about her, it was about what he had failed to see, and what he would no longer overlook again. By the time the check was quietly placed at the edge of the table, the night had already rewritten itself in ways no one had planned, and yet everything on the surface appeared exactly as it should be, the skyline still glowing beyond the glass, the soft music still weaving through the air, the low conversations returning to their measured cadence, but beneath it all something had settled into place, something subtle but permanent, and Ethan could feel it as clearly as he felt the weight of the pen in his hand when he signed the bill, not because the moment demanded attention, but because it had already done its work without asking for it, and as he placed the pen down and rose from his chair, the others followed naturally, gathering their jackets, exchanging final words, preparing to step back into the world they controlled so easily, yet the rhythm was different now, slightly slower, more aware, as if each of them carried a quiet reminder that control was not always where they assumed it to be, and Ethan adjusted his cuff slightly, a habitual gesture, but this time it felt less like preparation and more like grounding, and as the group began to move toward the exit, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his gaze shifting across the room not in search of something, but in recognition of someone, and there she was, near the far side of the dining floor, resetting a table with the same calm precision, aligning silverware, smoothing the edge of a white linen cloth, her movements unchanged, her presence steady, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and that was the part that stayed with him the most, not the language, not the correction, not even the moment of silence that had followed, but the way she returned to her work without carrying the need to be seen differently, because she already understood something the room had just begun to learn, that value does not depend on recognition, it exists whether it is acknowledged or not, and Ethan took a step in her direction before he could reconsider it. Not out of obligation, not out of performance, but because something in him had shifted enough that walking away without closing the moment felt incomplete, and when he reached her, he did not stand over her, did not command her attention, he simply stopped at a respectful distance, waiting until she finished placing the final fork before she looked up, her expression the same composed calm it had been all night, and for a second neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself carried understanding, and then Ethan inclined his head slightly, a gesture small but deliberate. "You changed the room tonight," he said, his voice quiet, not seeking agreement, not offering praise in the way he once might have, but stating something he had come to recognize as true, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not surprised, not affected, simply present, and when she responded, her voice carried the same steady clarity it always had. "The room was always capable of changing," she said, and there was no challenge in it, no correction, just a truth delivered without weight, and Ethan absorbed that, the meaning settling deeper than the words themselves, because it shifted the focus away from her and back onto something larger, something collective, and he gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of something he would continue to understand long after this night ended, and without another word he turned, rejoining his group as they moved toward the exit, the glass doors opening to the cool night air and the distant sound of the city below, and as he stepped out into that world again, the one defined by influence and outcomes and measurable success, he carried with him something that could not be measured in any of those ways, a quiet recalibration of what mattered, of how value revealed itself, and behind him, inside the warm light of the restaurant, Naomi Brooks continued her work, not louder, not different, just as she had always been, steady, precise, present, and in that presence was something the room would not forget, not because it had been forced upon them, but because it had been shown to them, clearly, undeniably, and without asking for permission, and that was the kind of power no one at that table had been prepared for, the kind that does not need to own the room to change it.